June 1943. The sun blazed over the crags and olive groves of Sicily like an angry spotlight. For General George S. Patton, the island was another battlefield to conquer, another stage to prove that American steel and American will could crush Hitler's grip on Europe. His tanks roared forward, his troops followed with fierce loyalty, and his reputation for brutality and brilliance grew with every advance. But while Patton pursued glory, another general waged a quieter, more internal war. A battle not of tanks and terrain, but of temperament and restraint. That man was Dwight David Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in the Mediterranean. Gentle in manner, measured in speech, Ike was the kind of commander who bore responsibility like a weight across his shoulders, refusing to let the public see the strain beneath his calm voice. Even in private correspondence, his raw emotions would sometimes slip. In 1942, on a particularly vexing day, he wrote to his wife, Mamie, "I'm so mad today that I shouldn't write to you, but the scribbling of a note might reduce the heat of anger." It was a rare crack in the facade, a glance at a leader wrestling with his own temper while steering a vast, unwieldy alliance toward victory. Eisenhower's temperament was a shield. Calm under pressure, he understood that his role was not to be the loudest voice in the room, but the steadier one, the one who balanced competing egos, battered alliances, and the brutal realities of modern war. And yet, even he had limits. Those limits were tested in August 1943, amidst the heady success of the Sicilian campaign. Patton, known to his men as Old Blood and Guts, had a gift for aggression that electrified his units and unnerved his peers. He insisted that battle fatigue, what modern science calls combat stress reaction, was a fiction, a weakness, a choice. In the ruthless logic of Patton's mind, any soldier who could not endure the terror of war was a coward who tarnished the courage of his comrades. It happened during a tour of field hospitals. On August 3rd, Patton encountered Private Charles H. Cool at the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia. The private was fully dressed, no apparent wounds, his gaze hollow. When asked what was wrong, he said simply, "I guess I can't take it." To Patton, it was an affront, an admission of failure. In a flash of fury, he slapped Cool across the face with his glove, hauled him to his feet by the collar, and kicked him toward the tent's exit. "You're going back to the front," he barked. Cool would later be found to be suffering from chronic dysentery and malaria, not cowardice, a cruel irony lost on Patton in that moment. A week later, the scene repeated itself. At the 93rd Evacuation Hospital near San Stefano, Patton found Private Paul G. Bennett, trembling and tearful. Rather than empathy, Patton offered contempt. He slapped Bennett, brandished his ivory-handled revolver, and cursed him for displaying fear. The medical staff intervened, shocked at the spectacle, a general's temper erupting in a ward full of wounded men. Word of these incidents rippled up the chain of command, eventually reaching Eisenhower's headquarters in Algiers. When Eisenhower read the reports, a storm of conflicting thoughts raged inside him. On one hand, Patton's violence was unacceptable. Brutality toward his own troops could not be condoned. On the other, Eisenhower knew that the war's fiercest battles lay still ahead, and Patton was one of the few commanders capable of leading American armored forces with both audacity and strategic brilliance. The general was invaluable, indispensable, some in Eisenhower's circle whispered. Eisenhower called for an investigation, but he did not want the matter blown into the public eye. Press correspondents had already caught wind of rumors, and Ike met them privately, urging them to hold the story back for the sake of morale. "General Patton must be saved for the great battles facing us in Europe," he urged them. For a moment a gentleman's agreement held. Eisenhower did not explode. Those who knew him best would later say that was the most frightening part. When the reports reached his desk in Algiers, Ike read them slowly, once, then again. 2 incidents, 2 hospitals, 2 soldiers already broken by war, struck not by the enemy, but by one of America's most famous generals. He set the papers down, folded his hands, and stared at the wall. Inside, the anger burned. Eisenhower's temper was not loud like Patton's. It did not shout or strike. It tightened, it coiled, and when released, it carried consequences. Privately, Eisenhower was furious. He wrote later that Patton's conduct was so completely lacking in soldierly understanding that it sickened him. To Eisenhower, discipline was essential, but so was dignity. An army that humiliated its wounded risked destroying the very morale it depended on. Yet even in his anger, Eisenhower understood the battlefield reality better than most. The Allies were not just fighting Germany and Italy. They were fighting time, logistics, and their own fragile coalition. British and American forces still distrusted one another. Command structures were new. The invasion of mainland Europe loomed like a storm on the horizon. And Patton, flawed, volatile, brilliant Patton, was one of the sharpest weapons the Allies possessed. Relieving him outright would send shockwaves through the army. It would delight the Germans, and worse, it might fracture American confidence at a moment when unity was critical. So Eisenhower chose the hardest path. He summoned Patton. When Patton entered Eisenhower's headquarters, he expected reprimand, but not the ice-cold disappointment that met him. Eisenhower did not shout. He did not curse. He spoke quietly, deliberately, with the voice of a man forcing himself to remain in control. Patton was ordered to apologize. Not once, not privately, but publicly. Eisenhower demanded that Patton return to each hospital, stand before the doctors, nurses, and wounded soldiers, and admit he was wrong. He would apologize to the men he struck. He would acknowledge that battle fatigue was real, and he would do so without excuse. For Patton, the order was humiliating. This was a man who believed fear was contagious, that mercy weakened armies, and that war was best fought with relentless aggression. To apologize, to wounded soldiers no less, felt to him like surrender. But Eisenhower was immovable. "You will do it," he told Patton, "or you will be relieved." Patton complied. At each hospital, he stood stiffly, helmet tucked under his arm, his famous swagger gone. His apologies were awkward, strained, sometimes barely audible, but they were delivered. Doctors later recalled the tension in the air. The great Patton, brought low not by the enemy, but by his own temper. To his credit, Patton did not protest publicly. He wrote in his diary that he felt ashamed and feared his career was finished. For the first time in years, the general who thrived on war found himself isolated, sidelined, and uncertain. Eisenhower's punishment did not end there. Patton was quietly removed from frontline command. When planning began for the invasion of Normandy, Patton, America's most aggressive field commander, was conspicuously absent from D-Day. Officially, this was never described as punishment. Unofficially, everyone understood. Instead, Eisenhower placed Patton in a strange role, commander of a fictional army group in southern England, inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, fake radio traffic. To the Germans, it looked like the buildup of a massive invasion force aimed at Pas-de-Calais. It was deception on a grand scale. And it worked. German intelligence fixated on Patton, convinced that where Patton went, the real invasion must follow. Even after Allied troops stormed Normandy, German commanders hesitated, waiting for Patton's real army to strike elsewhere. Eisenhower had turned Patton's reputation into a weapon, without giving him a single division to command. This, too, was Eisenhower's genius. He did not destroy Patton. He contained him, redirected him, used his strengths while restraining his flaws. Privately, Eisenhower continued to wrestle with doubt. Had he been too lenient? Too harsh? He knew that if the slapping incidents ever reached the American public, outrage would be swift and unforgiving. Mothers would demand answers. Congress would demand heads. For months, the story remained buried. But war has a way of unearthing secrets. In November 1943, columnist Drew Pearson broke the story in the United States. Newspapers erupted. Letters poured into Washington, some condemning Patton as a brute, others defending him as a warrior in a brutal war. Eisenhower stood firm. He accepted responsibility. He told Washington that Patton had been punished appropriately and that removing him permanently would harm the war effort. It was a gamble, one that tied Eisenhower's own reputation to a deeply flawed subordinate. History would soon test whether that gamble was worth it. By the winter of 1943, the storm Eisenhower had feared finally broke. Across the United States, the Patton slapping incidents ignited a furious public debate. Newspapers splashed the story across their pages. Radio commentators argued late into the night. Letters flooded the War Department, some dripping with outrage, others filled with admiration for a general who, in their eyes, embodied toughness in a softening world. To many Americans, Patton was either a monster or exactly the kind of man needed to win a merciless war. Eisenhower watched the backlash from afar, his jaw clenched, his words measured. He refused to be drawn into emotional defense or condemnation. Instead, he framed the issue the way he framed all things: responsibility first, victory second, ego never. He told Washington that Patton had been disciplined, removed from frontline command, and forced to apologize publicly, an act Eisenhower knew cut deeper than any demotion. He emphasized that Patton's behavior had been unacceptable, but also insisted that throwing away a proven battlefield commander in the middle of a global war would be a greater sin. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower paid the price for that stance. Some members of Congress demanded Patton's permanent removal. Senior officers quietly questioned Eisenhower's judgment. British commanders, already wary of American aggression, wondered whether Ike was too soft on his own men. Eisenhower absorbed it all. This was the unseen burden of supreme command, not just making the right decisions, but standing alone when no decision felt clean. In private letters to Mamie, Eisenhower's frustration spilled out. He wrote of exhaustion, of the constant pressure, of the anger he swallowed daily so others could function. His temper, always carefully contained, simmered beneath the surface. He understood Patton's rage more than he admitted, but unlike Patton, Eisenhower knew that a leader's fury could destroy everything if unleashed without restraint. And then came Normandy. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of France in the largest amphibious invasion in history. Eisenhower carried the weight of every casualty before the first landing craft ever touched sand. He had written a failure note in advance, taking full responsibility if the invasion collapsed. Patton was not there. Instead, he remained in England, still commanding a ghost army, its existence so convincing that German high command continued to believe a second invasion was imminent. Even as American soldiers bled in Normandy, German panzer divisions remained pinned in reserve, waiting for Patton. It was one of the most successful deceptions in military history. When Eisenhower finally unleashed Patton in August 1944, it was with purpose. Assigned command of the Third Army, Patton exploded across France like a force of nature. His tanks tore through German lines, covering distances once thought impossible. Supply officers struggled to keep up. German commanders reeled, unable to predict where Patton would strike next. This was the Patton Eisenhower had protected, Not the man who slapped wounded soldiers, but the general who shattered enemy armies. Eisenhower watched the advance with grim satisfaction. His gamble had paid off. The same man whose temper nearly ended his career now played a central role in the liberation of Western Europe. Yet Eisenhower never forgot the cost. He continued to rein Patton in, sometimes sharply. When Patton made inflammatory public remarks or crossed political lines, Eisenhower intervened. Their relationship became a constant balancing act. Admiration strained by mistrust, necessity tempered by caution. Patton, for his part, never fully forgave the humiliation of Sicily. He obeyed Eisenhower, respected him, but beneath it all, a resentment lingered. Two very different kinds of anger existed between them. Patton's explosive and visible, Eisenhower's silent and controlled. Both were dangerous. Only one was survivable. As the war dragged into Germany, Eisenhower's restraint proved decisive once again. He refused reckless charges for personal glory. He prioritized coalition unity over dramatic victories. He absorbed Patton's complaints, Montgomery's arrogance, and Churchill's pressure, holding the alliance together by sheer force of will. Victory came not with a shout, but with exhaustion. When Nazi Germany finally collapsed in May 1945, Eisenhower stood as the architect of Allied success. Patton stood as one of its sharpest blades, bloodied, controversial, unforgettable. History would remember the slapping incident as a stain on Patton's legacy, but it would also remember Eisenhower's response as a masterclass in leadership. He did not let anger rule him. He did not let genius excuse cruelty. And he did not let public outrage derail a war that demanded every ounce of discipline, patience, and restraint a man could summon. Behind the calm smile was a general constantly fighting his own temper, choosing control over catharsis, judgment over impulse. In the end, that quiet battle may have been Eisenhower's greatest victory of all.